Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pro Peace Report. This will also be airing on Indie News Network, my first video on Indie News Network, so that'll be interesting. But I want to talk about a really important topic today, and I don't think it gets talked about almost at all, and that's the intersection of imperialism, US imperialism, US militarism, and climate change. Because we will never solve the climate crisis until we get better international cooperation around the world and until we confront the US war machine that contributes to climate change more than almost anything else. And so I'm going to start by showing a video of Abby Martin, great journalist from RT, from the Empire Files. And Abby's asking Nancy Pelosi a question here about the intersection of US empire and climate change. So let's hear it.
Speaker Pelosi, you just presided over a large increase in the Pentagon budget. This Pentagon budget is already massive. The Pentagon is a larger polluter than 140 countries combined. How can we seriously talk about net zero if there is this bipartisan consensus to constantly expand this large contributor to climate change, which is exempt from these conferences? Military is exempt from climate talks.
Well, I just want to use an example if I can. The sea level rise is an important part of, what's happening to the climate. And I am not a defense person, but I've had so many talks with the Defense Department, with the Navy in particular, about how they have to respond to what's going on. So I really do think that there is no reason why what we're putting together, with Build Back Better and other things, can't respond to the Defense Department and have the same impact in terms of reducing emissions. And I do think that the Defense Department is very much aware of the fact that they have to play a major role, both from a strategic as well as, for the good of the world. So I don't see what we're doing in any way, or, increasing the defense budget as being something that's inconsistent with climate action. I really don't.
And may I just add that the national security advisors all tell us that the climate crisis is a national security matter. It is, of course, a health matter for our children, the water they drink, the air they breathe, etc. It is a jobs issue between clean technologies being the future of our workforce and the training for all of that. It is a national security issue because of the all of the conditions that climate crisis produces. I won't go into all of them, but they are cause for migration, conflict over habitat and resources, and again, a security challenge globally. And then the fourth, of course, the moral issue that we need to pass on this planet to future generations in a responsible way. Now, recognizing what you said, we recognize that as well. And a big user of fuel. There have been many initiatives over time, more successful with more technology, to convert from fossil fuel to other sources of fuel to run the military, because it would make the biggest difference. Transportation, defense, these are two of the biggest, that can make the biggest difference in all of that, and that is something we're very, very focused on. As I say, the Defense Department sees this systemically, that we have to stop it as a national security issue, and one way to do that is to stop our dependence on fossil fuels, which exacerbate the climate crisis. But that,
it's so frustrating the way that Pelosi and the other speaker responded to that question by Abby Martin. And so first I want to kind of break down a little bit of why is a rising US military budget fundamentally incompatible with solving climate change? And so I'm going to pull up some articles here on the screen. So first, we're just going to verify what Abby Martin was saying, that the US military is a bigger polluter than as many as 140 countries. Shrinking this war machine is a must. And it's so important because that's the military alone, not all the other US emissions, which are more than anybody in the world per capita, but the military itself pollutes more than 140 countries. And the speaker had said, not Pelosi, but the speaker before Pelosi, had said that he didn't see why a rising military budget is fundamentally incompatible with climate action. And so let's look. This is just, I don't even think this is all of the US military bases around the world. These are the ones that we know of, and this is from 2015. And you can see just how many countries have US military bases in them. It's all around the world. And then let's look here at the US military budget. $778 billion a year, every single year, which is more than all of these countries combined, the ones closest to us in military budget spending. China, India, Russia, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, Italy, Australia. All of their military budgets combined are less than the US military budget. Just this year, the House passes a $768 billion defense bill, supersizing Biden's Pentagon plans. In a bipartisan blowout, 181 Democrats teamed up with 135 Republicans to push the bill across the finish line. So more Democrats supported raising the military budget than Republicans did this year. The Democrats, who claim to be the party of climate, are continuously increasing the military budget. They have no response. They have no plan to draw down the US military presence around the world. And that presence is polluting the world more than anybody else. And that's what's so frustrating, is that people tend to look at climate in its own category. Climate change is here in this individual category. Defense spending is over here in its individual category. And notice that when Pelosi is responding to that question, she talks about, oh, climate change is a national security issue. You know, we should convert the fuel that the military uses to a cleaner energy. But that doesn't cut to the heart of the problem, which is the US military's presence around the world. They don't have any plans to actually scale back, carbon emissions in the military. But we need to scale back the entire size of the military itself. Why are we dominating the world militarily? Like, what reason? Why can't countries have their own militaries? Why does the US need to be the military police state of the world? And then, so let's also talk about here. So what's in the Build Back Better bill? Because the first speaker before Pelosi had said, he thinks that Build Back Better is doing great in terms of, easing the military's impact on the world. But let's talk about what Build Back Better does for climate action. So you have $555 billion are for programs to incentivize the use of electric vehicles, solar and wind energy, and decarbonize certain industries. But as this article points out, it doesn't end the $15 billion annually in direct government subsidies for oil companies, like those represented in the House Oversight Reform Committee hearing, said Food and Water Watch. So, and that bill is only putting $555 billion, and that's over the course of like 10 years. And I already showed you before that military spending, yearly discretionary military spending, is $778 billion. So over the course of a decade, we'll be spending $555 on climate in this bill, when just this year we put $778 billion for military. And so you see, the government prioritizes military spending over climate action. And so now let's talk a little bit more about the pollution of the US military itself. Why is the military so polluting? The US military's carbon footprint is enormous. Like corporate supply chains, it relies on an extensive global network of container ships, trucks, and cargo planes to supply its operations. So let's go down a little bit. If the US military were a country, its fuel usage alone would make it the 47th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, sitting between Peru and Portugal. In 2017, the US military bought about 269,000 barrels of oil a day, every day, 260,000 plus barrels of oil, and emitted more than 25,000 kilotons of carbon dioxide by burning those fuels. It's no coincidence that US military emissions tend to be overlooked in climate change studies. It's very difficult to get consistent data from the Pentagon and across US government departments. In fact, the US insisted on an exemption for reporting military emissions in the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. This loophole was closed by the Paris Accord, but with the Trump administration due to withdraw from the accord in 2020, this gap will return. We've seen that change now. Many, though not all, US military bases have been preparing for climate change impacts, like sea level rise. Nor has the military ignored its own contribution to the problem. As we have previously shown, the military is invested in developing alternative energy sources like biofuels, but these comprise only a tiny fraction of spending on fuels. The American military's climate policy remains contradictory. There have been many attempts to green aspects of its operations by increasing renewable electricity generation on bases, but it remains the single largest institutional consumer of hydrocarbons in the world. It has also locked itself into hydrocarbon-based weapons systems for years to come by depending on existing aircraft and warships for open-ended operations. And so it's just so frustrating because they keep giving more money to the military every year. They keep antagonizing foreign countries around the world with drone strikes, with sanctions programs, foreign interference that we would complain about if it was done to us. And so now let's talk a little bit about even more impacts of of the US military. So actually I want to talk about this one first. Nuclear testing legacy is cruelest environmental injustice, warns right experts. In an appeal to governments worldwide to get rid of weapons of mass destruction, the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics said that the Trinity tests in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, were the prelude to two horrific explosions suffered by the innocent people of Japan during World War II. So let's talk a little bit more about these nuclear weapons tests that the US has historically done. This had created a legacy of nuclear testing that is one of the cruelest examples of environmental injustices witnessed, and in what should be a peaceful island paradise. From 1946 to 1958, 67 nuclear bombs were detonated on the Marshall Islands. He said the equivalent of more than 1.5 Hiroshima-sized explosions every day for 12 years. Communities have suffered unimaginably from radioactive contamination, and this continues today with a legacy of contamination, illness, and anguish, the expert insisted. Similarly, in French Polynesia, over 200 nuclear tests were conducted over a 30-year period from 1966 to 1996, subjecting inhabitants to associated health and environmental damage, said the special rapporteur. And we don't see a drawdown of nuclear weapons today. We don't see the Democratic Party, who claims to be the party of climate, who claims to be the party, they don't even claim to be anti-war anymore. Anti-war breaks along partisan lines, as in half Democrats support wars, half Democrats are against them, and the same with the Republicans nowadays. But you never see the Democratic Party talk about denuclearization. They'll talk about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. They'll talk about denuclearizing Iran, but they won't talk about negotiating with countries around the world, nuclear powers around the world, whether it's Russia, China, any country that has nuclear weapons. We don't negotiate for a drawdown in it anymore. We don't see a drawdown in any militarization happening anymore. We just see constant antagonization between these countries. And as an example of this, we have Obama faults Russia and China for, quote, dangerous lack of urgency on climate change. Former President Barack Obama expressed confidence at the UN climate talks Monday that Biden administration will ultimately get its $555 billion climate package through Congress, and faulted U.S. rivals China and Russia for what he called a, quote, dangerous lack of urgency in cutting their own climate-wrecking emissions. When it comes to climate, time really is running out. But what's so frustrating, and let's see, I think it actually talks about it a little here. His comments come as conference leaders acknowledged Monday that many key sticking points exist after a week of talks. A trust gap between rich and poor nations on climate change issues emerged when the negotiations went through a check of what's been accomplished and what's left to be done. Developing countries used versions of the word disappointing 5 times when leaders talked Monday about the progress to date. And so what's so frustrating about it to me is that let's look at historically who has polluted the world with carbon dioxide the most. So we see here in the 1700s, started as the UK, the British Empire. We start to see other European countries emerging: France, Germany, USA, Belgium, Poland, Austria, Netherlands. Now we see the 1900s, for the US, by far, becomes the biggest polluter in the world. We only just now, in the late 1900s, start to see the rise of China. And they're still cumulatively only around half of the US's all-time carbon emissions. And so why doesn't Obama talk about the fact that as the empire of the world, as the country that's polluted the world the most, the United States should be the one that takes the biggest hit first, that cuts their carbon emissions drastically first before any other countries. Now I get it. China is a big polluter, but on a per capita basis, you see here, wealthy nations lead per capita emissions. Saudi Arabia and the US are 1 and 2, tied with 17.6 metric tons of CO2 per capita, per person. We have to remember, so China's at the bottom of this, below France, below Italy, below Russia, below Germany, below Japan. We have to remember that China has like 1.3 billion people. They are a country that started developing after the US and the Western nations in Europe. So now China pollutes more total CO2, but still per person, their emissions are less. The developing world in general almost feels like they need to use CO2. They need to use fossil fuels, they think, because, well, that's how the Western nations got ahead. That's how the rest of the world developed through their industrialization. Why aren't we allowed to do the same thing? And my thing is, I think we need to get off of fossil fuels immediately. I think we need a plan right away to stop using them. But we need to be more accommodating to poorer, less developed countries that started after we did. Why don't we see? I don't understand the antagonistic relations between the US, Russia, and China. Why is Obama antagonizing Russia and China instead of saying, okay, we admit we've been the worst polluters in the world per capita. We've polluted the world more than anybody else up to this point. Yeah, we think that Russia and China should also get serious about cutting down their emissions, but we will work with them and we want to take the lead because we haven't done enough either. the US carbon emissions are still sky high. We still only have like what, 20, 30% of our energy use is through renewable energy. So instead of antagonizing countries with new Cold War tensions, why aren't we drawing back the influence of the US military? Why aren't we saying we are no longer going to be the world police? We want to be a world leader on diplomacy for climate, a world leader on diplomacy against war. But we don't see that. We antagonize for war. And so now let's compare what was Green Party candidate Howie Hawkins' 2020 platform on environment and on war, and how is that better than anything we're seeing from the Democratic Party? Because I think this is so important. So eco-socialist Green New Deal, public ownership and planning in energy, manufacturing, and transportation. Now, if we remember here, when I was talking about the Build Back Better bill, not that one. When it comes to the Build Back Better bill and its climate provisions, it includes $555 billion for programs to incentivize the use of electric vehicles, solar and wind energy, and decarbonize certain industries. But notice that word incentivize, because that is the key difference between what Democrats want to do for climate change and what eco-socialists like Howie Hawkins want to do. Howie Hawkins wants public ownership and planning in energy, manufacturing, and transportation. So the whole point would be, rather than letting these fossil fuel companies and their profit motive driven intentions dictate where we go on climate, no, the government should nationalize oil companies. We should have public ownership of the entire energy industry, because then there's no profit motive involved. Then it's just people electing politicians and the government being the one who's planning this decarbonization effort, not putting incentives out there and hoping that the goodwill of these oil companies plays out. No, we should be nationalizing it so that the people can be the ones deciding what happens with these oil companies. How soon should they be drawing down? It shouldn't be these oil capitalists deciding for themselves. Even if we change the market around, they'll just find more ways to pollute. They won't go with the sense of urgency that we need them to go. 0 to negative carbon emissions by 2030, within 9 years. 100% clean energy by 2030. Ban fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure. This new fossil fuel infrastructure one is key. We still see Biden signing oil drilling permits. We still see Democrats scared to speak out about Line 3 in Minnesota, which will increase carbon emissions. No nukes. I already just described earlier some of the ways. I gave you a very brief overview of how nuclear weapons testing has caused environmental destruction and public health problems. But nobody talks about ending nuclear weapons entirely, disarmament. Disarmament was a huge topic during the Cold War. Now it's just completely forgotten. No Democrats talk about it. Zero waste manufacturing and recycling, electrified rails, heat pumps to heat and cool buildings. But let's talk about his peace policies as well, because I think these are intertwined beyond climate and imperialism and militarism. Pledge no first use of nuclear weapons, should be obvious. Unilaterally disarm to a minimum credible deterrent, because the whole point should be is we don't need enough nuclear weapons to destroy every country in the entire world. We should only need enough nuclear weapons to defend ourselves from attack. No first strike. Negotiate with nuclear powers to enact the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. End the endless wars. U.S. troops home. Because when we're dropping bombs on Afghanistan, when we're dropping bombs on Iraq, when we're dropping bombs on Yemen, we're destroying these countries' infrastructure. We're polluting their environment and killing people with the impact of our weapons. And so ending wars is a key part of solving climate change. Because A, when you're going to war with another country, you're not having diplomatic relations with this country. You're going to war with it. And you're setting them back in their own climate resiliency. It's what causes all of these refugee crises that happen, because people in the Middle East who are suffering from US imperialism, who've had their infrastructure destroyed, who had their economy destroyed, they end up fleeing to Europe because that's where it looks like there's the economic opportunity, and our country was destroyed. And it will get worse as climate change gets worse. And when climate change starts raising the temperatures in the Middle East, and now they can't grow crops as they used to, rivers are drying up, so now they can't grow things either. Climate change is going to create a bunch of refugees, and if we keep going to war with countries, we're just going to add on top of the environmental impact. It'll be the war impact plus the climate impact. They won't have any climate resiliency. Cut the military budget by 75%. So if we were looking here at the military budget, even if we cut it by 75%, it would still be more than most countries in the entire world. Maybe only China would have a bigger military budget than us. There's no reason why we need to be having a military budget bigger than the next 10 countries combined. And it raises every single year. We see Democrats raise it more and more and more and more. So when Nancy Pelosi responds to Abby Martin, and when the US government's team there responds to Abby Martin by saying, yeah, Build Back Better will solve the problem, I don't see why Build Back Better is incompatible, why a bigger military budget is incompatible with climate action. It's incompatible because we should not have this many military bases around the world. There's no reason for it. It's just US domination. We shouldn't have a bigger military budget than the next 10 countries combined. It's unnecessary. It is causing the US to be a bigger polluter than 140 countries in the world. We pollute, our military alone pollutes like a mid-sized country. Imagine if we scaled our military back to only defensive. We're no longer being the world police. We're no longer dictating what happens in your country with our brute military force. If you change that fundamental dynamic and make it so that the US military is purely defensive, and we shrink it by 75% even, well, now, instead of being bigger than 140 countries, maybe now the US military is only bigger than like 30 countries, 40 countries. Do you understand how big of an environmental impact the drawdown of the US military globally would be? It would be way more impactful than a $555 incentivization for private companies to do the right thing. That's like tiny compared to the impact of cutting the US military, of ending US imperialism around the world, and focusing on ourselves, on focusing on the environment. It will be a net benefit for everybody in the world if we can end US imperialism and really seriously cut back the environmental impact of the US military. So that's all today. There's a lot more I could talk about on this topic. I'm probably going to do way more videos about this in the future, because I think the intersection of climate change and imperialism and militarism does not get discussed enough. Imperialism is one of the worst problems for the entire world. It impacts more than just Americans. Climate change impacts more than just Americans. The fact that these two issues intertwine so seriously shows that that needs to be a bigger topic of focus. If we're ever going to end climate change, we need to end US imperialism and endless wars. Until next time.